Good evening, everyone. I'm Larry Kudlow. Welcome back to the Kudlow Report, where we believe free market capitalism is still the best path to prosperity. All right, topic A tonight and the whole week. Is Treasury man Tim Geithner out of the closet as a hard money king dollar protector? This question looms large this weekend as growing fears of a global currency war come to head as global finance ministers are meeting in South Korea. The sinking U.S. dollar, down over 10% since late spring, will be at the top of the agenda. Now, earlier this week, a new wrinkle to the story emerged when Mr. Geithner delivered a speech suggesting a reversal in the dollar's fortune may be in the cards. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The United States of America and no country around the world can devalue its way to prosperity, to competitiveness. It is not a viable, feasible strategy, and we will not engage in it.
All right, that was huge. The next day, in a Wall Street Journal interview, Geithner suggested the dollar is low enough relative to the euro and the yen. I strongly hope that Mr. Geithner truly believes this, and I wonder if he isn't persuading Fed head Ben Bernanke to go absolutely minimal on any QE2 money pump priming, or maybe better yet, we don't need QE2 at all. Anyway, this week the dollar had its first gain in a month and a half, and gold fell nearly $50. However, driven by solid earnings reports and the Tea Party congressional cavalry coming to rescue Washington on November 2nd, the Dow rose 70 points for the week and closed at 11,132. My question tonight is whether the dollar is set for a rebound, and if so, what might that do to stocks? Let's bring in our two distinguished guests. Joining us now all the way from Singapore to discuss possible dollar resurrection, famed commodities investor and old friend of mine, Jim Rogers. He is the chairman of Rogers Holding Company, also holding the fort, U.S. here, Chicago, I guess, CNBC contributor and all-star investor Andy Bush of BMO Capital Markets. All right, Jimmy Rogers, you probably don't believe a word of it, but Geithner made some very strong pro-dollar protection statements this week. He bashed devaluation, and he said the dollar's low enough against the euro and the yen. Do you think the greenback is set to rally, Jim Rogers?
First of all, Larry, why would you pay attention to those guys in Washington? They never get it right. They never get it right. Geithner has been wrong for 15 years. And the people in Washington for 15 years have been saying we want a strong dollar, and then they do their best to debase the dollar and drive it down. Having said that, the dollar is so low right now, and there's so many bears on the dollar, including me, that I would expect the dollar to rally for a while.
Oh, very interesting. Now, Andy Bush, Jimmy Rogers has a good point with his skepticism about government officials, but I do think it's significant, Andy, when the Treasury Secretary speaks about currencies as publicly and forcefully as Mr. Geithner did this week. It's certainly worth paying attention to. People forget it is the Treasury that has statutory authority over the dollar exchange rate. So let me ask you also, do you believe it is possible, either through intervention or jawboning or maybe a minimal QE2, that the dollar is set to rally?
Right. I do think that there's a very good chance that the dollar is going to rally because the expectations for quantitative easing are just outrageous right now. We had two Fed governors, Lockhart and Bullard, come out and suggest that the Fed could buy up to $100 billion a month for quantitative easing. So the markets, especially the currency markets, have latched onto that and really sold the dollar aggressively, too aggressively, I think. We've seen some taking back of that. The dollar has risen against the Swiss franc just over the last couple of days. So I do think people are looking at Geithner's statement and going, well, gosh, maybe the U.S. isn't trying to devalue the currency, and that could lead to a very strong rally after the Fed meeting on November 3rd.
All right, so Jimmy Rogers, if that occurs, if there's a dollar rally after the Fed meeting on November 3rd, what does that do, first of all, to your spécialité de maison? Maybe it's de la maison, gold and commodities, Mr. Rogers.
Well, obviously, if the dollar's rallying for a while, the opposite is probably going to be true of gold. Larry, everybody's bullish on gold, too. You read the surveys, 95, 98% of the people in the world are bullish on gold. That's never good for any asset, no matter what it is. I own gold. I'm not selling gold, but I certainly wouldn't buy it now, not with 98% of the people in the world bullish.
And what about stocks, Jimmy Rogers? Take it the next step. If the dollar rises and the swells on Wall Street, as Andy Bush suggested, are discounting much too much Fed pump priming, who knows where they're going to come out? They may have a super cautious statement. They may fake out everybody. What does that do to stocks? Stocks have rallied this week. Stocks have been on a terrific run, Jimmy. What would a stronger dollar do to stocks?
Part of the reason that the stock market's rallying is because with the dollar down, reported earnings of international companies are up. That's not real, but they're at least reported earnings. So a rising dollar would hurt earnings for a while. But Larry, having said that, my view of the world is that if the world economy gets better, I want to own commodities because their shortage is developing. If the world economy does not get better, Larry, I want to own commodities because then the governments are going to print money. That's all they know to do. It is the wrong thing to do, but they don't know any better. They live in Washington. They think printing money is good.
Well, of course, Andy Bush, Jimmy has a point over the longer term. The guy does have a very interesting point about printing money. But I guess you're saying, Andy, walk me through this again. Everybody is too excited and hyperventilating about how much money the Fed is going to print. Do you think Geithner and Bernanke are huddling with some of the other finance ministers and saying, wait a minute, we're all going to go slow on this? Is that going to come out of this Korean meeting?
Well, you know, there's a lot of rumors talking about whether or not the Fed could play some kind of active policy role along with the Treasury in crafting some kind of compromise to go to the Chinese with. I'm not sure that that's, going to happen, but it's fascinating to see. Those two have worked very closely together over the last 2 years, so it really wouldn't surprise me to see the Fed be influenced or certainly maybe retract some of the quantitative easing they were going to do if the dollar holds in there and if China decides to do something that would open up their markets more. I'm not quite sure what would come out of this. I think the best thing that Treasury Secretary Geithner could do would be to go to the Chinese and say, look, here's a policy we're going to change. We're going to have an IRA on steroids. We're going to allow, we'll develop something that allows Americans to deposit as much money as they want, tax-free, as high as they want, and that's going to increase savings. So something like that, and we'll open up our technology exports. What can you do, China, to come back to us to come to a compromise?
Well, all right. So, Jimmy Rogers, I'm going to give you another shot at this because here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing currency stability, which I regard as very bullish for stocks and the economy. I also hear, Jimmy, that there's a Tea Party cavalry riding to Washington on November 2nd that is going to slash federal spending and keep tax rates low. Now, if I think the dollar is going to be steady and government is going to be limited, and I know that earnings are rising by 25% or better, that has to be roaringly bullish for stocks, Jim Rogers.
Larry, first of all, I will have to say, it looks as though somebody in Washington, for once, is listening to the markets. They saw the dollar collapse when they said we're going to print more money. They saw gold go through the roof. Even Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Geithner must have noticed that the market refused to accept what they were doing. So maybe they are going to cut back on printing money, and maybe they will change their approach at least a little bit. I'd be stunned, but it would be good news if that were the case.
And maybe the Tea Party Congress that's coming up, Jimmy, will limit government spending for the first time in our lifetime and hold back tax rates, hold them down. Wouldn't that be bullish? Remember, corporate earnings are doing very well.
Of course it would be bullish, Larry, but you believe in the tooth fairy, too, if you think that anybody's going to go to Washington and stop spending money, for goodness sakes. Don't you remember in 1994, we had a Republican Congress. They came in with a contract with America. Oh, my goodness. Don't you remember the results? Spending kept going through the roof.
Well, we had a good run.
Why do you believe in the tooth fairy?
There was some fiscal restraint. I do believe in tooth fairies. You know that. You've known me for many years. I do believe in tooth fairies. Yes. Andy Bush, I'm going to give you the last word because you're not optimistic about stocks. Is that right?
No, I'm not. And I think that some of the stock buying that we've seen over the last few months has been predicated upon the Fed doing more to help the U.S. economy, which I think is mistaken. So the expectations, as I mentioned earlier, are just so high right now, they have to come back. So typically as we get through earnings, and the earnings have been very good, I totally agree with that, but there is always kind of the letdown, the hangover, and I think that's what we're going to get for a few months.
All right, gentlemen, you're very kind. I appreciate it. Jim Rogers from Singapore, thank you. Great to see you. Andy Bush from Chicago, always great to see you.